Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Been thinking about prophetic voices in the First Testament and working our way through the story of Elijah. And we're going to read some verses from 1 Kings chapter 17, beginning at verse 17. Sometime later, the woman's son became sick. He grew worse, and finally he died. Then she said to Elijah, "O man of God, what have you done to me? Have you come here to point out my sins and kill my son?" But Elijah replied, "Give me your son." And he took the child's body from her arms, carried him up the stairs to the room where he was staying, and laid the body on his bed. Then Elijah cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, why have you brought tragedy to this widow who has opened her home to me, causing her son to die?" And he stretched himself out over the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, please let this child's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's prayer, and the life of the child returned, and he revived. Then Elijah brought him down from the upper room and gave him to his mother. "Look," he said, "your son is alive." Then the women told Elijah, "Now I know for sure that you are a man of God, and that the Lord truly speaks through you." Well, in our signpost on the previous verses, we learned that Elijah had been moved to a new location and had received fresh provisions from the Lord. We also noted that this move was a further challenge to the pagan god Baal, who had thus far been unable to prevent the drought and was now unable to prevent the Lord from providing for his prophet in the heart of Baal's own territory. Verses 8 to 16 introduce a new character into the narrative, a poor widow who is suffering from the effects of the drought to the extent that she has all but run out of food and expects to die of starvation. The text suggests that the Lord has already been at work in her life, and now, through Elijah, God calls her to put her trust in him by promising that neither her flour nor her oil will run out until the next successful harvest. The reader knows that will not be for 3 years, but the widow has no idea how long the drought will last. So this will be a big step of faith for her. In order to put that promise to the test, or perhaps in order to show that she believed the promise, she has to use up the little flour and oil she has to feed Elijah. A principle that flows through this story and indeed throughout the Bible is the idea that by commanding us to trust him, God obligates himself to be proven worthy of that trust. By using the last of her provisions to feed Elijah, the widow demonstrates that she believes the promise of the Lord that Elijah has spoken. And in doing so, she discovered that God was indeed faithful to keep his promise. Neither the oil nor the flour ran out, not just that day, but, as the text implies, for the next 3 years. Now, it's easy enough to believe the promises of God when those promises don't require anything from us, when there's no personal cost attached. But genuine faith in God is faith not merely in words, rather it is lived out in our deeds, and at times living obediently will be very costly indeed. Jesus is very clear on this point that there is a cost to following him. In fact, he almost goes out of his way to put people off from following him because the cost is indeed so great. We may be perfectly happy to trust God from the peace and security of our own personal comfort zones, but God always calls us to step beyond them, to venture into the unknown, trusting that he will keep his word. Elijah demonstrated his trust in God when he went to King Ahab with God's message. Excuse me. He trusted God when, at God's command, he went out into the desert during a drought. He demonstrated his trust in God further when, once more, at God's command, he went to the heart of Baal's territory to live with a widow, expecting her, the poorest member of society, to provide his meals. True faith always leads to acts of faith. The widow demonstrated her faith by using up the last of her flour and oil for Elijah. In each instance, Elijah and the widow found that God was trustworthy and that his word was true. So here we have a widow, no doubt brought up in pagan worship, possibly a regular at the temple of Baal, who has heard a word from Yahweh, the God of Israel, from his prophet, and she has acted on that word. As a consequence, she discovered that Yahweh is the God who keeps his word. One can easily imagine her faith and confidence in God growing each day as she went to her jar of oil and her jar of flour and discovered that they had miraculously filled up overnight. What a faith building experience that must have been, to know the provision of God in such a tangible way every day. It's wonderful when our trust in God is affirmed by his providential care like that, and natural, I guess, for us to want to tell others about it. If she was alive today, she would no doubt have a podcast telling people about Yahweh and his provision for those who trust in him. Her book would be at the top of the bestseller lists, and she would be being interviewed on every chat show. Yet, as we must all discover sooner or later, not only do we have to act on our faith and demonstrate in our actions the faith we have in God, but sooner or later, that faith will be put to the test. Having been saved from starvation due to the miraculous provision of the Lord, we discover that the widow's son became ill, and he got worse each day until finally he died. In the ancient world, there were few medicines and few people with any medical knowledge, and death was an ever-present reality. However, it's clear from the text that the widow regarded the death of her son as some sort of punishment from God. Although she mentions her sin, she's not specific about its nature. And it's possible that since she was a Phoenician and that she had worshipped Baal and the other Phoenician deities, that this was what she had in mind. Whatever was in her mind, she assumed that the death of her son is a judgment of God against her. Yet despite her sin, whatever it was, the Lord had preserved her and her family, directing Elijah to their home, providing oil and flour, and presumably water for them all. In that context, apart from the judgment for sin, her son's death doesn't make any sense. Even Elijah seems perplexed by her son's death, but he also senses the hand of God at work in this tragedy. On a purely theological level, we can affirm with Job that the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Yet we can't quite ignore the difficult contradiction that seems to lie within the text. For surely God's promise and the miraculous provision that fulfilled the promise were given on the basis of sustaining Elijah and also preserving the life of the widow and her son. Without that miraculous provision, both the widow and her son would most likely have starved to death anyway. And so the death of her son seems to contradict the purpose of God in providing for them. Sooner or later, followers of Jesus discover that, as Dale Davis puts it, Yahweh both provides and perplexes. It seems likely that to some degree at least the widow had turned from worshipping Baal and had come to believe in and to an extent worship Yahweh, the living God. She had, in the words of the psalmist, begun to taste and see that the Lord is good. And now this tragedy erupts in her life. For this widow, the experience of the never-ending flour and oil was a time of peaceful trust in God's generous provision, no doubt leading to a growing faith in the God of Israel. And now that faith faces the worst of tests, death itself, and not only that, but death of her only son, the one who would look after her as she neared her own death. I wonder if the widow thought for a moment that it might have been a mistake to abandon Baal and turn to Yahweh. I wonder if she was tempted in that moment to return to worship Baal. Perhaps you can think of a time in your own life when you were walking closely with God and suddenly out of nowhere you were plunged into the depths of some calamity or hardship. It's not hard to imagine some of the questions that must have been going through this widow's mind. Yet there is more to this incident than simply a test of faith for the widow or for Elijah. In fact, this tragic incident is central to the whole story. Ever since Elijah appeared on the scene, this unfolding story has been about the supremacy of God in creation, and in particular, his supremacy over the pagan god Baal. In that context, the events around the death of this widow's son are a further example of the supremacy of the Lord, and a further illustration that he, and not Baal, is the living God who gives life. In Canaanite mythology, Baal was not only the god of the storm and the rain, but since all harvests depended on the rain, he was also thought to be the giver of life. Baal's worshippers believed that when Baal gave the rain, the earth yielded its bounty and the people prospered and thrived. If he withheld the rain, then the crops died, and so did the people. In their pagan worldview, at the end of the growing season every year, another pagan god, Mot, the god of death, defeated Baal, who then descended into the netherworld, where he remained throughout the dry season. In the autumn, with the help of his consort Anat, Baal became victorious over Mot and returned, bringing life-giving rain for the next growing season. Yet, as one scholar notes, Baal's power over life was at best indirect. In the weather patterns of ancient Canaan, the rains either came or they didn't come, and people felt the impact of more gradual cycles of plenty and want. But what about the death of people? Even in Canaanite mythology, Baal himself could not escape from the netherworld without help. What could he do for the widow's son? In reality, Baal was just as dead as the trees that had been cut down to make his images. What this story is telling us, and this tragic aspect of it in particular, is that the Lord is the only true and living God, and he will demonstrate his direct power over life and death, even in the heart of Baal's own territory. Davis notes that the double references to Elijah crying out to the Lord are significant. He notes that Elijah, great prophet as he is, nonetheless is not some religious magician who struts into the widow's distress, brandishing some instant razzle-dazzle that is always at his disposal. No magic words, abracadabra. He is no candidate for super prophet. He is rather a servant who can do nothing but plead with Yahweh over the affliction of this recent convert. He twice cries out to the Lord using the same form of words, but his two pleas are not identical. The first is in the form of an accusation, in which he turns the widow's distress into a prayer. "O Lord, Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die?" He then pleads for the boy's life. The stretching himself over the boy prior to this prayer seems odd to modern readers, and preachers have come up with all kinds of fanciful ideas to explain it. However, it was actually just a typically symbolic prophetic act common amongst the prophets in ancient Israel. As one scholar puts it, it was an acted out way of saying, "Let this lifeless body be as my lifeless body." Elijah's actions remind us that we can do nothing by our own power, for even the great prophet Elijah is helpless apart from what has been called the helplessness of prayer. Prayer is God's appointed means of grace for our difficulties, the way we must take through the maze that we are bound to walk through in this life, with all life's twists and turns and dead ends. Prayer is the way we have to take. The widow and her son had been rescued from the jaws of death by Yahweh, the God of Israel. Instead of starvation, they were given an unending supply of food. However, as scholar Ian Provan puts it, it's one thing to rescue people from the jaws of death, but can Yahweh do anything when death has clamped its jaws tight and swallowed the victim up? He can act across the border from Israel and Sidon, but is there a border that he ultimately cannot cross, a kingdom in which he has no power, when faced by Mot, the Canaanite god of death? in the underworld? Must the Lord, like Baal, bow the knee? The text tells us simply that the Lord heard Elijah's cry. What follows from Elijah's plea is the first recorded instance of resurrection in the Bible, as the boy returns to life. It was Yahweh's resounding answer to the question of which God is the true God, which God is the giver of life, which God has the power over death itself. For the widow, and no doubt her friends and neighbours, and readers of 1 Kings, there is to be no doubt. Yahweh alone is God. He alone is the giver of life. He alone is supreme over death. We should also see in this as a sort of sign story pointing to the resurrection of Jesus. Excuse me. In the same way as the resurrection of Jairus' daughter in Mark 5 does, or the resurrection of the widow's son in Luke 7, and of course the resurrection of Lazarus in John 11. Like our text today, they show that Jesus' power extends over and into the realm of death. As we read in Revelation 1 verse 18, where Jesus says, I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. The widow knew this to be true, not in some abstract way, but in reality she knew it to be true. But I don't think this was a sudden revelation for her, for she'd spoken of the Lord in her first encounter with Elijah and had enjoyed the Lord's miraculous provision. I think through this event she came to a deeper realization of the truth that she had come to see since Elijah arrived on her doorstep, namely that the Lord alone is God. She understood the truth in a deeper and fuller and more personal way than she had before. It's also likely that this incident deepened Elijah's faith and trust in God and gave him the faith to directly confront the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel in the near future. When our trust in God is deepened and strengthened, it leads to even greater acts of faith and trust, which in turn deepen our faith and trust as we discover the trustworthiness of God. And so we are led to even greater acts of faith and trust, which in turn deepen our faith and trust, and on it goes. With that in mind, we are left with a kind of disturbing question from this text. What is it that stops us from trusting God? Is it our fear? God is trustworthy and will prove himself worthy of our trust. All we have to do is place our trust in him. Thanks for listening.